Hey everybody, happy Wednesday morning. I'm excited because we have a really cool topic today, which is what role does acting play when learning a new language? And this is actually a topic that I feel really fascinated by and I've been wanting to discuss it. But the thing is, I don't actually have any formal training or expertise in the art or the science of becoming an actor or an actress, right? And so what I'm gonna do today is discuss my perspective on, the way that I think about acting and how it's helped me tremendously when learning languages and especially using them out in the world. But then I've actually gone and found a really amazing actor who also happens to be a really spectacular language learner and speaks a bunch of different languages. And so in a few weeks, we'll be doing a little short series together, talking to a real expert on all the different techniques and methods and ways that perhaps all of us could benefit from understanding how trained actors and actresses go about learning their roles. Now, real quick, in case you're not familiar, anyone who supports me on Patreon does get the opportunity to ask their own questions to anybody who I bring on as a guest to the channel. So if you'd like the opportunity to ask this mysterious actor your own questions, then feel free to go to patreon.com/Robin MacPherson. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. And today I've actually got my tulip whale blue mug. I love this shape. I haven't used it for a while. So the first way that I find acting to be really, really useful when learning a new language, as I think about it, as if I were an actor, learning to play a role and trying to do so really convincingly, right? Really try to, embody a true speaker of that language. Well, it's the mindset that it gets you in, right? Because it really helps you to focus in on the intricacies of the behaviors of people who speak that language. How do they move their bodies? What facial expressions do they make? What are the certain patterns that they can sort of exhibit? What is the accent that they might use? And so many different things. And so while very often people who don't think about it in this way, they might think just broadly, well, cool, I want to try to behave like a French speaker. But when you think about it as learning to play a role, that's not sufficient, right? Because French is spoken in so many different places around the world. So once you frame it as a role, it really focuses you in on, okay, well, which type of French speaker am I going to perhaps imitate, right? Am I someone who speaks French in Belgium? Am I someone who speaks French in France? Or maybe in the Congo? And even more than that, there are these layers, am I a Parisian French speaker, or am I going to be someone who's from perhaps further down south? And what are the differences? So I think the mindset that it gets you in, it helps you to really be a lot more focused, and I find this to be really beneficial. So the first technique that I have here is actually sometimes picking a specific person, right? A specific speaker of the language that I really enjoy. So sometimes this could even be a friend, right? So I've had situations where I didn't have a lot of people to speak to, but I had a friend who I could talk with and who I really appreciated the way that they spoke, the way they behaved, just the person that they were. And then that was a nice sort of role model for me learning that language. But I've also had situations where I've taken, for example, I remember that I had a bunch of different interviews with Marc Levy, who is the author of a bunch of these books on my bookshelf. And I really enjoyed and appreciated his sort of mannerisms, his general tone of voice, the way he spoke, everything from the tonality of how he spoke. He's kind of shy and timid, and I appreciate that because he also still has a very sharp sense of French humor, which I love. And so I took him as a role model for a while, and I was studying interviews with him, listening to his accent. And it's not that you ultimately want to just copy a person, but the point is that picking somebody, which I think is common in acting. I know that there are situations when an actor is going to play a role where they might actually sort of take a real person in real life and study them, because it really helps you to focus in on certain things. And I find that if you rotate through and over time you sort of do these case studies on different speakers of a language, you can start to really pick and choose the things that you like and form your own unique persona that is true to who you are, but it also fits that culture of people who speak the language you're learning. Now, the next thing I find really interesting about thinking about acting when learning a language is it actually makes my bond a lot more special with each particular language, because it starts to really feel like I actually gain something in my personality, who I am, from each language I learn, because I do start to associate the language of German, for example, a lot more closely with what it means perhaps to speak German like a German person, to behave like a German person. Of course, these are very, broad generalizations, but there's a lot of really interesting truth that you can find through thinking of it this way. And so the first thing is that this actually helps me to keep my languages separate. It really helps to, make that context I have built up around a certain language a lot more robust. And so when I'm speaking Spanish and when I'm speaking French, for example, they're so different to me because the role of a French speaker versus the role of a Spanish speaker and the specifics that I've chosen, they're so incredibly different. So even though those languages are quite similar, I don't think I ever really mix up Spanish and French. And I think it helps that I have built up these really rich contexts around those two languages. Another thing that I really love about this is that I do believe it makes me a more well-rounded person, because what happens is when I'm speaking Japanese, for example, I really absorbed so much about Japanese culture, and I found that it actually had a big impact on who I am as a person. So when I'm speaking Japanese, I'm gonna really, lean in to those characteristics that are more typical in Japan. I'm not gonna be very confrontational when speaking Japanese. I'm not gonna be as direct. I'm gonna be extremely polite. I'm gonna really take responsibility for basically everything, no matter what happens. And when I speak English now, I may not do all of that, right? But what I do is I take my favorite parts, right? I appreciate the sort of politeness that exists in Japanese. I really appreciate how they take responsibility for things. I can appreciate how they're able to be so non-confrontational in certain circumstances. I can really appreciate a lot of other things, how considerate Japanese people are. And so I can kind of pick and choose my favorite parts and add them to my own personality when speaking my native language. Now, when I went to live in Germany for a brief time, I had a shock, right? And I found that people were extremely direct. But I also found that that was missing from my personality, right? I found that I felt I was a little bit deficient in, being able to be direct. And so over time, learning different languages, I really feel like it's helped me to become a more rounded person. And so I really like that aspect of, again, adopting these different roles in each language and then applying my favorite parts to myself. The next thing is, I believe that this approach really does make you a deeply empathetic person, right? Because even with languages that you don't speak, as you start to navigate the world, I really believe that once you get a lot of experience having to learn the role of a different person, learn all these different ways of thinking, all these different thought processes, these different customs and things that are acceptable in one language and totally unacceptable in a different language. I think as you navigate the world and you encounter different types of people, you do start to be a lot more empathetic, and you start to realize that if someone does something that you think that's not very polite, or oh, that's a bit weird, you start to think, I wonder if this is a part of their culture. I wonder if this is just a way that we are different in our backgrounds and, the cultures that we come from. Another thing is that I just think this makes life so much more interesting. So for me, when I go out and navigate the world outside, when I'm on the subway, riding a train, walking around, whatever it is, I'm just constantly now observing people, and I'm trying to find patterns and correlations and, trying to figure out what are just simply individual differences, right? Because of course, within a culture, there's an enormous amount of variety. Everybody's different. Everyone is their own unique person. And so being able to differentiate, well, what is it about this person that's just them as a unique individual? But what is it about them that is coming from that cultural context from which they sort of, approach the world? That's fascinating to me. And so even if I'm not learning the language, for example, I'm not learning Persian, but I've had wonderful experiences with people from Iran, for example. Some of my best friends in Hamburg were actually Iranian. And so even then, just like being curious and thinking, wow, what is it about the Persian culture that is impacting the way I'm experiencing these relationships with people that come from Iran, and what is it that's just them as unique, beautiful individual people. One more thing I love about this is that there are so many layers and you can really go pretty deep, right? So as I mentioned earlier in the video, you could just say, okay, what are the very broad strokes of, generally speaking, French speakers? There are some things and it's quite interesting. But then you can say, okay, well, what about certain countries? How do people, again, from places like the Congo behave when they speak French versus somebody from Belgium or France? And then more specifically, but you can go even deeper. Let's take Italy, right? I think Italy is just such a wonderfully rich country in terms of just such a patchwork quilt of different languages and different dialects, different types of people. And so super interesting to think, like, what makes somebody from Naples different from someone from perhaps Milan, right? But then even more, like, what about Naples versus like Salento, right? Like these, or, there's just so many differences that I think you can find. And again, it could be dialects and accents, behavior, are they more optimistic or pessimistic in certain parts of the country? I just think it's fascinating. And on that note, that's my final sort of thing, is I love getting to the point where I can not just focus on having a good Italian accent, for example, but having a specific accent. Like, do I want to model my accent around someone from the South, where I found that the vowels are very nice and open, like bene, molto bene, right? It's very nice and open. Or someone from like really further north, where maybe the vowels are more closed, like bene. It's been a while since I've spoken Italian, so that might not be quite on the mark. But I remember noticing these differences, and it's really, really fun to model your accent around those different people. Okay, everybody, that was a bunch of information. I have so many thoughts on this, but I'm really curious to get your thoughts. So please let me know if you have also found different ways, maybe some that overlap with my thoughts on acting for learning a language, but also if you have your own thoughts and different ways that you think about it. And with that, I wish you a fantastic Wednesday. Cheers, and I'll see you back here on Friday for another awesome episode.